All right. Welcome back, guys. Yesterday, we had discussed kind of the causes of the Great Depression. Today, we are going to move on and just kind of start to talk about what life is like during the Great Depression for people in America. The Great Depression is worldwide. It's happening, all across America, Canada, all throughout Europe as well. America, because it has so many resources and such a strong economy, it's not going to be as bad as, the Great Depression in Europe, but it is still going to be, the most trying economic times in American history. That's in large part because the Great Depression affects the three biggest parts of our economy: agriculture, the stock market, which also includes factories and industry, and banking, finance. So all three of those major areas are going to be affected by the Great Depression, which is going to cause the average American to be severely hurt economically by this depression. The estimates are anywhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 people are out of work, which means somewhere between 25% and 33% of Americans won't have jobs. It's an incredibly difficult time period. So, what's life like for people in the cities? Well, because unemployment is so high during the Great Depression, what we are going to see is that it's primarily men who are working. At this time period, although there are significant portions of women who are in the workforce, they're going to lose their jobs. And once if you're when the stock market crashes and these businesses go out of business and you lose your job, one of the first things that happens is you find out really quick that your biggest bill is your mortgage or your rent payment. And so many of these people in cities who are out of work, they're going to lose their homes. That's kind of the first thing to go. And what starts to happen is that the men typically try to send their wives and their daughters away to live with family. And so, if I'm a husband, I've got a wife and some kids, I try and pack up the wife and kids and send them off to their parents or to a sister or a brother's house out in the countryside. And the men typically stay around the cities. And that should make sense because they're looking for work. There's more work opportunities in the cities than elsewhere. And the type of work that they're looking for is generally just day work. So they're go to a factory and say, "Hey, do you have something I can do for today?" Like they want long-term jobs, but many places aren't hiring long term, and so these guys are looking for day work. Sorry, you might be able to hear my dog in the background. She's getting restless, but you're a good girl. So these workers are going to be looking around for shift work, but they don't have homes. And so what they start to do is they start to set up shanty towns on the outskirts of these major cities. And essentially every major city is going to have one of these shanty towns built. Now, you might be asking, what's a shanty town? Well, it's essentially a makeshift town that is where the homes are created out of whatever scraps are left around. And so you'll have, people using scrap wood and scrap pieces of metal, tin, to put together essentially like lean-to housing and living, kind of like the forts you would make as a kid, in the neighborhood with like leftover construction supplies. And so these pop up essentially outside of every major city. And so the men will live in those shanty towns, sleep there at night, and walk into the city to try and find work the next day. Now, these shanty towns are pretty basic, right? They're not going to have plumbing. They're not going to have paved roads. They're not going to have generally running water, and so these people are living on dirt floors and really kind of awful conditions, conditions we would think of as third world conditions today. But these shanty towns were organized. Most of these people they used to be middle class people. They still have middle class values. They want to obey the law. They want to be organized. And so they'll set up their own system of government in these shanty towns. They'll elect their own mayor. They'll have people act as kind of volunteer police and firemen in these shanty towns. They'll establish rules for themselves, sanitary rules and behavioral rules, things like that. And these shanty towns will become known as Hoovervilles. They mockingly name these Hoovervilles because President Herbert Hoover is believed by many people to not be doing enough to try and solve these economic problems. Hoover's one of these, holdover, laissez-faire or hands-off, guys. And so, he doesn't really believe that it is the government's job to provide handouts to the poor, and it's not his job to over-regulate the economy. And because of that, people think he's this heartless guy and that they've lost their homes because of him. And so they start to name these shanty towns after him and call them Hoovervilles. Interestingly enough, one of the largest Hoovervilles in the country is going to be just outside of St. Louis. It'll have its own mayor. Now, it's not an official mayor, but it'll have its own mayor, its own police force. And the city of St. Louis will actually treat its Hooverville as if it is its own city, and kind of give it a semi-official status. We'll see inside and outside these Hoovervilles that, people are starting to not be able to feed themselves. And so soup kitchens and bread lines are going to be, all across the city looking, for people who are looking for relief. Now, initially, these soup kitchens are all essentially private organizations, right? Private churches or school groups that are organizing to feed the poor. But when you have somewhere between 25 and 30% unemployment, churches just won't be enough to feed all the people that need to be fed. And so, there are many people at this point arguing that it needs to be the government that steps in and starts to run these things. Herbert Hoover will resist that, but his predecessors will not. Minorities tend to have it worse than your average white citizen. And again, that should make sense because we know, because of the system of sharecropping in the South, that African Americans in particular had been kept to an economic disadvantage by the 1920s. World War I and the Great Migration. Things are they're actually starting to look a little bit better for African Americans. But then when the crash happens, they're going to be, they're going to be losing those jobs that those high paying skilled labor jobs that they had just started to be able to get. And, honestly, what really is devastating for the African American community and why it makes the Great Depression is harder on minorities than it is on the established white majority. It's time. It's the amount of time that African American families had to save money, right? Because of sharecropping in the South. the blacks were kept in debt. African Americans were kept in debt. And so they just were able to escape that system of what, we refer to as economic slavery. And they just started to accumulate wealth. And right when they're starting to save up some money, all of a sudden, stock market crashes, everybody's losing their jobs, and they don't have as much money saved up as their white counterparts who have had these better jobs for longer and maybe already own their house or have some, money set aside, or, they've been able to, the established white community's been able to pay off their debts in ways that the African American community hadn't been able to do. So, sorry. We're going to see an increase in violence in these cities. We're going to see riots again, competition for jobs. We're going to see deportation of immigrants on the rise. There's this belief that these immigrants are taking jobs from American citizens, and so deportations will be on the increase as well. We're going to see increase in strikes and even violent strikes. As wages start to get frozen, workers will start to go on strike. And, these businesses who, really there's, issues with demand, don't feel like they're in a position to be able to pay their workers more. And, the two sides will clash. The sad thing is both sides actually, have a point. Because of World War I, wages had been frozen for a very long time. These workers, really do expect raises. They were asked to not take raises for patriotic reasons during World War I, and the workers did that. When the war was over, they said, "Look, it's been years since we've had a raise. We deserve a raise. You need to give it to us." Businesses who had been making a ton of money during World War I, all of a sudden the war ends. They've overproduced. Nobody's buying their goods anymore. They've got their hands on all of this product that nobody's willing to buy. They can see the writing on the wall that their businesses might fail. And they look at their workers and say, now's not the time for a raise. Both sides are, you have a good point. Now, are some owners not giving raises because they're greedy? Yes. Are some workers demanding too much money from their employers? Yes. But the average business and the average worker, they just, they're in two different places. And both of them make really, pretty solid points. Right. We're going to start to see, because of the economic pressure, we're going to see riots and hunger marches and the overall community starting to rise up to one, either scare away economic competition in the case of riots, or in the case of hunger marches, for the community to rise up and say, hey, look, we need, the local church isn't enough to be able to take care of everybody's needs. The government needs to step in. So here's a photo of, kind of a standardized Hooverville. If you take a look in the background, you see, it's an industrialized city where, workers have been priced out of their housing. And so in the forefront of the picture, you actually see the Hoovervilles. The houses look like shacks. You've got a dirty ground, that when it rains just gets muddy and gross. You could tell these houses were just kind of haphazardly put together. No plumbing, so you're going to the bathroom in an outhouse. No running water. You're really cooking out of a fire pit. It's definitely not an ideal situation. If you're lucky, you could set up a Hooverville next to some sort of water supply, which will make your life a little bit easier. But that's also kind of disgusting because you're getting your same water from the river that people are going to the bathroom in and bathing in, and there's some sanitary issues there as well. One of the most famous Hoovervilles. It's not really a Hooverville, although, a lot of similarities, is going to be the one that the Bonus Army sets up outside of Washington, D.C. Here's where you need to take notes really well. You need to write down the main ideas of what I'm saying because you're not going to see bullet points on the slide, but you definitely need to know what the Bonus Army is. So the Bonus Army is just World War One vets, right? They're these World War One veterans that have been promised a bonus for serving in World War One. Now that bonus was originally designed to get paid out over a series of years. Well, boom, then the Great Depression happens. And when the Great Depression happens, guess what people need right now? They need money, right? And so, these Bonus Army marchers, these World War One vets, essentially say, you know what? The government owes us this money. They said they were going to pay it out over the course of years, but we would like this money now. And so they ask President Hoover if they can get an advance on their bonus. Hoover says no. And so they show up to kind of protest march in Washington, D.C. to demand that they get their bonuses now because they have families to feed. Now, the Bonus Army is incredibly organized. They set up a kind of makeshift Hooverville in Washington, D.C. They know that if they want to get their bonuses paid early, they have to keep public opinion on their side. And so these Bonus Army marchers are going to set very strict rules in their Hooverville. No drinking, no gambling, no women, no cussing, right? They don't want to do anything that might be perceived as, disrespectful or negative or anything like that, because they're really their economic future is on the line here, and so they're very organized. They're very respectful. There's no panhandling or begging, and no drinking, no gambling. They're very, very respectful. Well, they essentially tell Hoover that we're going to stay here until you give us this bonus. And so Hoover, looks around and says, you know what? We can't afford it. His concern is he knows he's got to pay these people over time, and the government has the money to pay them over the time. But Hoover looks at this situation. He says, if I pay you up front, the government doesn't have that money now. And he doesn't believe in deficit spending. He doesn't believe in spending money the government doesn't have. And so he doesn't want to put, he wants to keep the budget balanced. And so he tells these Bonus Army marchers, no, there's just not money and you have to go home. And he's not technically wrong. We have a right in this country to protest. For sure. But you can't protest whenever and wherever you want. You have to have permits for that. Well, these veterans don't have all those proper permits. And so Hoover says, you got to go. And the protest marcher says, we're not going. And so Hoover turns to a young General Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is kind of an up-and-coming American general. He's very ambitious. And Hoover turns to MacArthur and says, MacArthur, I want you to disperse these protesters. But Hoover gives him directives to treat these protesters as World War I vets, right? To disperse them, but to do it peacefully. Well, Douglas MacArthur has different ideas. He shows up to the Bonus Army and tells them to disperse. They won't do it. Well, Douglas MacArthur doesn't like being told no, and so he orders his troops to attach their bayonets. The bayonet is that very long knife that gets attached to the end of a gun that's used to, stab people with. It's a very intimidating weapon. And MacArthur, does that on purpose to scare the Bonus Army, World War I veterans. And he proceeds to order his troops to to push out the World War I vets out of this bonus army. And as that happens, the bonus army, the Hooverville, gets lit on fire somehow, and these World War I vets are essentially pushed out at gunpoint. The American public sees this, and guess who they side with? It's not Hoover and MacArthur. It is definitely with the bonus army marchers. And so it really, like, you just can't attack vets that way. Vets that are demanding something that is, rightfully theirs, if not technically theirs. And so the public really kind of turns against Hoover. MacArthur is going to really kind of escape any criticism. Hoover's going to take all the blame, which I would argue is probably unfair. This is not the way Hoover wanted it to go down. He actually had a lot of sympathy for these guys. He was just trying to do what he thought was best for all of America. Now, you can make an argument that he was wrong there, but he certainly didn't want this Hooverville to be burnt down. And my dog's going to make an appearance. Hi. Hey, say hi, Peyton. Say hi to the crowd. Oh, all right. That's my dog. So Hoover is, he takes the blame, even though he didn't want Douglas MacArthur to react the way that he did. This is going to, just kind of instill in the American people this sense that Hoover's disconnected, that he doesn't really care about the American people, and, is kind of this heartless, guy. All right, that's where we're going to leave off for today. We'll pick up with the struggle of the American struggle during the Great Depression tomorrow. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.